Sophiapol of Nanterre University. We'll discuss this book 20 years after its publication with Michael Hardt, Étienne Balibar, Veronica Gago, and Sandro Mezzadra. The initial idea was to organize a full-day conference here in Paris, in which several generations of scholars and activists would be able to discuss together such a great book, which played an important role for social and political theory and for the social movements of the beginning of the century. Unfortunately, due to the pandemic, we postponed the conference of a year, and we are still unable to organize it on site today. On the bright side, a lot of you in other countries and continents can actively participate in this debate, a debate that promises to be even more urgent because of the situation in Palestine, the expulsions in Jerusalem and the bombings in Gaza. One of the most important theoretical and political points of empire, in fact, consists in the renewal of internationalism. What solidarity we could ask ourselves beyond national borders, how to support concretely liberation movements and social struggles on a transnational level. And I believe, I hope that among other things, we will have also the opportunity to talk about this issue. Now, before giving the floor to Matteo for a quick introduction, just 2 points regarding the logistics of the meeting. Michael will take the floor first with a talk of about 30 minutes. Michael teaches at Duke University and is the author with Tony Negri of the tetralogy Empire, Multitude, Commonwealth, and Assembly. He will then be followed in order by Sandro Mezzadra, Veronica Gago, and Étienne Balibar for 20 minutes each. After that, Michael, if you want, you could react to these speeches. And finally, we'll open the debate with the audience. Sandro, as you probably already know, teaches at the University of Bologna and has written in the last years with Brett Nielsen, Border as Method and the Politics of Operations. Veronica teaches at the University of Buenos Aires and has recently published in English Feminist International, and with Lucy Cavallero, a feminist reading of that. And Étienne, beyond the many translations available in English, is now publishing in French a collection of 6 volumes in which several of his writings are collected in a systematic way. Now, we have decided to set up this interface so that everyone can take the floor and appear on everyone's screens in order to facilitate interactions between audience and speakers. So we ask you to be very careful in using the platform. There are many of us, so it's really important to mute the microphones. If you want to intervene after the speakers during the debate, it will be sufficient to raise your hand, and when you will be named by me or Matteo, turn on the microphone and speak. Okay, so thank you all for your understanding, and thank you all for being here with us.
Thank you. Thank you, Davide. Thanks to all our guests. And thanks to the laboratoire Sophiapol of the Paris-Nanterre University. Let me just say a few words to introduce our topic of today. So this evening we will discuss about Empire. Empire, a book written in the second half of 90s and published in 2000. A book that became immediately a worldwide success, a classic for global studies, and a political manifesto, namely, for several social movements. Empire's reflection, we know, were reworked in Multitude, 2004, Commonwealth, 2008, and Assembly, 2017, thus giving rise to a rich and, we can say it, controversial debate about his thesis. But we can start with a first question, and it is, why was that book so successful? And I think that we can give two answers to that question. First of all, we can say because of its political engagement. We all know that the hypothesis of Empire not only had a profound relation with practices, claims, and activists, people of different social movements, and I'm thinking of the ultra-globalization movement or of the no-war movement, but we all know that empires also constituted a complete theory of global capitalism and the forms of social struggle that ran through it. Secondly, second answer to my question, the book was so successful because of its theoretical novelty at the beginning of the century. Why? Because on the one hand, Negri and Hardt provide an original analysis of geoeconomic and geopolitical transformation after the collapse of Soviet bloc. An analysis based on the discussion of several classical categories of ancient and modern political thought. I think of empire, categories such empire, multitude, sovereignty, constitution, and common, obviously. But on the other hand, Hardt and Negri elaborate also a powerful social ontology and political theory. Social ontology and political theory based on the hybridization of workerist Marxism with the philosophy of Gilles Deleuze and Michel Foucault, and with feminist and postcolonial studies. Now, I will finish. 21 years later, the aim of this meeting is to review the strengths and the shortcomings, both, of this thesis. And consequently, I think that two questions can guide our debate. The first one is theoretical or analytical, and I can formulate it as it follows. What concepts and hypotheses developed in Empire are really important today for a contemporary critical theory of global capitalism? Are there some ideas or categories that must be changed or transformed? And if yes, which ones and how? First question. The second question is political or strategic, and I can summarize in a very simple way. After authoritarian rise of neoliberalism and in the middle of the pandemic transformation of capitalism, what does Empire teach us? Why and how should we read this book in that new historical context? Now, as Davide said, we will listen Michael first, then Sandro, and then Veronica and Étienne. And in the end, we will have a discussion with the audience. Obviously. Michael, thank you again, and it's up to you.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks to especially to Davide and Matteo, but also really to Veronica and Étienne and Sandro for being willing to participate, and I hope that the three of you can see that I've prepared my remarks really with you three in mind, about things that I think you three know more about than I do, and so I'm hoping that with the three of you, even just with the three of you in mind, it helps me think through them. I also wish I were at the level that I could make this discussion about the current events in Palestine. I prepared something much different and theoretical, but maybe in the discussion we could enter into today's events because, or the last day's events because they certainly relate to the themes in question. I guess my remarks really have to do with Matteo's first question about the extension of concepts or the revision of concepts. If I were to have a title, I would call it the prerequisites. Actually, it fits in the umbrella of a project that Tony and I talked about a long time ago, the prerequisites of communism. Or you might say the prerequisites of class prime. That's the other way, and I'll explain maybe what I mean in a minute. At the center of Empire's conceptual and political project is a theory of multiplicity, or really a theory of two multiplicities, empire and multitude. Every political theory of multiplicity, I think, is, or at least should be, two-sided, about the multiplicity of the forms of power, and then also the multiplicity of the forms of resistance or revolution. I thought that the theory of multiplicity that we had worked through in that book was actually pretty successful for the political project we recognized at the time. I also found it rewarding with respect to theories of multiplicity in Foucault and Deleuze and Guattari, notions of dispositif, diagram, Foucault's notion of a constellation of resistance, also Deleuze and Guattari's notions of agencement, of abstract machines, plane of consistency. I think this is things we were all building on. But of course, I think that one needs to, or we need to, develop this notion of multiplicity. Recently, Tony and I have attempted to develop a notion of class prime. This was in a way our reflection in an essay last year or the year before, about 20 years after the publication of Empire, a notion of class prime that builds on and consolidates politically the concept of multitude. By class prime, we mean, it takes a bit to explain, I suppose, but we mean basically something different from and more than the working class, rather a multitudinous class composed of equally struggles against capital, struggles against heteropatriarchy, against white supremacy and other racial hierarchies, against coloniality, and so forth. And hence, a notion of communism that goes well beyond what Marx could imagine, a notion of communism that includes not only, like I said, the supersession of capitalist relations of production, but also the supersession of heteropatriarchal social relations and racist social relations, etc. Ambitious, and I suppose I'm not yet able to give a theory of that. Like I said, I'm trying to work on the prerequisites. So what I prepared, yes, is the prerequisites, working out some of the prerequisites of this project. Yeah, like I said, of class prime, or more ambitiously of communism. Okay, so it seems to me that we need to develop Empire's theory of multiplicity in at least three directions. This is partly what I'm going to attempt. First, account for and engage multiple structures of power and organization of liberation in terms of race, gender, sexuality, coloniality, in addition to capital. And to do that, put Empire in dialogue with, or at least the notion of multiplicity we had worked through, in dialogue with other theories of multiplicity of power, roughly characterized as a certain version of intersectional politics. That'd be a way of thinking of it. I mean, I'll get to more in a minute. The second thing that I think needs to be a second direction maybe, is to develop a concept of articulation adequate to the mode and logic of relation among elements of a multiplicity. This was perhaps already implicit in Empire, but and especially in its anti-dialectical project, that we had done in many books. And so in a sense, what I'm thinking about is a concept of articulation that contrasts with mediation. Thinking of mediation here as a dialectical concept, one in which the many are always able to be subsumed within the one. Whereas articulation is a set of provisional relations among elements that are relatively autonomous. I'll get to try to explain that a little bit more in a minute. The third direction, I think, that we need to develop the notion of multiplicity from Empire is to confront the political problem of the relations between those two multiplicities. In other words, this is something that seems to be not dissimilar from the problem of the technical and political composition of the proletariat. I mean, in other words, that thinking back to that tradition, that the technical composition does not dictate or imply the political composition. In the same way that the analysis of the structures of power does not dictate the forms of liberation and resistance in relation to them. Okay, I'm going to come to all those. I just wanted to lay out the map before I get started. Yeah, one inspiration, and now I'm just thinking more textually before I really get started with the newer thought. One inspiration that I thought moved past, that partway down this path, was something that Tony and I wrote about in Commonwealth, the use of multitude, the concept, to analyze the so-called plebeian struggles in Bolivia at the beginning of the century. It was things that we had read at that time, written by the Comuna group, so Raquel Gutierrez, Alvaro Garcia Linera, Raul Prada, Luis Tapia, during the war on water, the war on gas in Bolivia at the time. And what inspired us then was the way they used multitude to think of a multiplicity along two axes. That in those struggles in Bolivia at the time, this was their analysis, there was a multiplicity of forms of labor. In a previous generation, the miners had in some ways subsumed the labor struggle in Bolivia, but rather there was a multiplicity of forms of labor in terms of waged and unwaged, precarious work, informal work, non-industrial work, etc. But there was also a racial ethnic multiplicity in the struggles along the different indigenous groups in Bolivia, but also non-indigenous populations, so that this intersection between two multiplicities is the way they read multitude. You can see this is already taking a first step of what I'm thinking of. So that the articulation of capital and coloniality, plus the articulation on the other side of labor struggles with anti-colonial, anti-racist struggles. And so that helped us see, I think, how a concept of multiplicity and a concept of multitude could be enriched in relation to race and coloniality, as a first thing. So, but I want to develop this notion more of articulation. I think you'll see how I'm getting it in a minute. What I want to take a step back. This is maybe part of the talk that's completely unoriginal, but I'm hoping you can see how it helps me think through this. I want to think through notions of racial capitalism and capitalist patriarchy. Both of them developed really in the early 1980s or late 1970s. And the first I want to think through is an essay by Stuart Hall about racial domination and capitalist rule in South Africa. This was something published in 1980. And he was reading South African authors who were writing on this topic, and he was creatively reinterpreting Louis Althusser's concept of articulation. This is from the Althusser's essay in the Reading Capital collection. In fact, returning to Reading Capital myself after this, I see how articulation must have been a central concept in the seminar as a whole, because all of the authors in Reading Capital work through the concept of articulation in different ways. So here, this is Hall now working through this, because he wants to say in South Africa and in other instances of racial capitalism, race and capital articulated means two things. To say that this articulation is that neither is autonomous, that racial hierarchy and capitalist domination are not completely separate, and that the one does not derive from the other or hold supremacy over the other. That that racial hierarchies are not derived from capitalist domination, and it certainly doesn't function in some sort of traditional structure, superstructure formation. Instead, and this is the first characteristic of articulation, instead, race and capital are at once relatively autonomous and mutually constitutive. That the two structures of power are on equal footing, but distinct and inseparable. This is already a rather complicated formulation, seems to me. Articulation then, is this non-dialectical mode of relation. Relatively autonomous and mutually constitutive. So Hall develops another aspect of articulation, again through a creative reinterpretation of Althusser, it seems to me, And here's the second characteristic of articulation. Because he says that although race and class are in principle, in some sense equal, let's say on equal footing, that is what I'd say in English, that in a specific conjuncture, one structure can play a dominant role over the others. And so his examples are that in societies of plantation slavery, there is an articulation of race and capital, obviously, but plantation slavery in the Americas is what he's talking about then. But in that situation, race is a structure in dominance with respect to capital. Whereas post-emancipation in the United States, there is still an articulation of race and capital, but that in those instances, capital serves as a structure in dominance. So just to say, now putting the two together, I hope you can see what at least where I'm starting to go. So articulation on the one hand says that the structures of domination are relatively autonomous and yet mutually constitutive. And on the other hand, in a specific conjuncture, one can play a role of dominance with respect to the other. Okay. I think that the same thing is going on in socialist feminist developments of the notion of capitalist patriarchy, even though for them the concept of articulation or the term articulation is not present. But let me just run briefly through what that means here. I mean, just to say the same thing in a way I'm thinking primarily here of US and British feminists working in the late 70s, early 1980s, but I'm sure it translates elsewhere. On the one hand, capital and patriarchy are relatively autonomous, they're on equal footing, as I say, and yet capital and patriarchy are inextricably tied and mutually constitutive. Okay, that's the first part. And the second part is that there are, in a specific conjuncture, a specific instance even, there are relations of dominance. Here I'm thinking of, if the textual thing can be helpful for anyone, Heidi Hartman's classic essay, classic within the US context, called The Unhappy Marriage of Marxism and Feminism. And she talks about two instances of dominance. You know, her instances are the construction of the family wage is an articulation between patriarchy and capital, but one in which she says patriarchy has a position of dominance with respect to capital in the construction of the nuclear family via the notion of family wage. She says, on the other hand, in the instance of the status of the belonging of children, this is so, in other words, the fact that when children are productive, say in an agricultural society, they belong to the father, whereas in instances where children are unproductive, not allowed to work, they belong to the mother. That this is this shift. So she says, in this instance, capitalism is a structure of dominance with respect to patriarchy. All I wanted to get here is that it's a similar development of the notion of articulation between structures of power that have this dual relation. Okay, now I'm in the position for a fuller view, which, as I said, is not intended to be particularly original, but as a means of elaborating or negotiating the relation between two concepts of multiplicity, between the notion of multiplicity that Tony and I have been developing in Empire with Multitude, etc., and I would say even, what do we call it, historically, a parallel development of a notion of multiplicity through these such notions as capitalist patriarchy, racial capitalism, etc., you know, which would have to put all these together. So here then are the two conceptual points. Maybe I shouldn't even say these again. The first is that what we have to analyze and understand and what exists today are multiple structures of domination. Call them heteropatriarchy, capital, coloniality, racial hierarchy, etc. That they are all relatively autonomous. They're all on equal footing with respect to each other, and yet they're mutually constitutive, intrinsically tied. I hope that part you can take for granted. And yet in a specific conjuncture, one can exist within dominance to the other. So in fact, just to give a shorthand of contemporary examples of this notion of, in the contemporary conjuncture, this structure of power and dominance, I would say, and maybe I'll go into this slightly more in 5 minutes, that today in the US, and I wonder if in Europe too, one would have to say that race fills a structure of dominance with respect to capital, Also, even with respect to patriarchy and others, that is prime. It's yes, and that it organizes the articulation in the very present of the United States. It seems to me that in Latin America, and certainly the way that Veronica works through the struggles, starting with Argentina, but working in other Latin American countries too, it seems to me that part of her argument is, and that the struggles arguments are too, is that gender today, gender hierarchy, fulfills that structure of dominance in the articulation between patriarchy, capital, racial struggles, etc. So here arise two problems, and that maybe these two problems are what I'll end on. The first is a conceptual error that I think arises from these formulations. And the conceptual error is to read the conjunctural relation of dominance in general or absolute terms. I find this today in the US, and I hope if I give you a shorthand, it makes sense to you, that the conjunctural dominance of race, if one were to accept that, seems to me too often read as a general priority of race over gender, over capital, etc. It seems to me there's a confusion of temporalities or a way in which articulation falls back into mediation. That might be another way of saying it. You see what I mean? That in some ways, what the error I'm trying to point to is one in which race is in a position to subsume the other forms. The second is not so much an error; it's more like a problem, a problem, a real problem, meaning one for which I don't have a solution. And it's this: the question is, what is or should be the relation between the multiplicity of structures and power and the multiplicity of struggles for liberation? So as I said, this bears some relation, and it's useful for me, and for some of you, I think it will be too, to relate this to the problematic of the relation between the technical and political composition of the proletariat. But you can leave that aside if it doesn't work for you. Yeah, and just thinking back to a different generation, the way in which the centrality of industrial workers in production seem to, for many groups, imply the centrality of the industrial worker in political organizing. That's the problematic and that I'm looking at. Like, in what sense does the relation of dominance within the current structure of power relate to the possibility of the forms of organizing against it? So there you see. So let me just try that in terms of Black Lives Matter today in the US. I mean, Black Lives Matter since George Floyd's murder, roughly. One thing that's super inspiring that I've found in the demonstrations in the various movements is the way in which at all the demonstrations, it's not just a matter of racial hierarchy, that the demonstrations also emphasize the anti-capitalist nature of it, the feminist nature, they affirm Black trans lives, etc. But it seems to me that done in such a way that race takes priority over and in some sense subsumes those other struggles, or rather, maybe I should say it this way, that those other struggles appear within the context of race. The second, so there's some way in which articulation falls back into mediation again. That's what I'm trying to say here. Or that conjunctural dominance of the forms of power seems to dictate organization. So in my view, and maybe I'm really just leaving with these problems that I arrive at, in my view, that relation in forms of organization has to be resisted. And maybe this is a way of returning to the concept of multitude, to insist on the multiplicity as a principle of organization. The multiplicity that it can never be reduced to some form of unity, regardless of the conjunctural dominance. So this is where a concept of class prime would have to come in as a mode of political organization of such a multiplicity, and one that doesn't and can't be ever reduced to a single component of it. I mean, maybe that's inherent to the notion of multiplicity itself. So here, this is where one would have to start a whole nother elaboration, to say what class prime would have to mean in this context. or even as I indicated earlier, what a notion of communism that would be the culmination of such a struggle would mean. But here, I think I have to stop partly because of the time. And really all I intended to do is work through some, like what I'm calling prerequisites, in which I see, especially the work of the three of you being instrumental to, or you know, key to developing this further. So I'll stop there. I hope that's okay to stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. Sandro, do you want to take the floor?
Sure, and thank you for the invitation. We have gathered today to celebrate Empire 20 years after its publication. And I am convinced that Michael and Tony's book deserves a celebration. Needless to say, it was written in the 1990s in a world that was very different than ours. And the book bears the traces of the Clinton age. It would not be otherwise. I will come back to this point in a moment, but for now, let us remind the way in which globalization was discussed in the 1990s. Mainstream liberal scholars and pundits had no doubt. After the end of actually existing socialism, globalization was a process driven by just two historical forces: market economy and liberal democracy. A borderless world was emerging, to put it with Kenichi Omae, and no relevant conflicts were in sight after the quote and unquote end of history. It was the age of la pensée unique, Ignacio Ramonet commented from the left. Capital had broken free of the burden of the antagonistic relation that had historically constituted and limited it, and was bringing about the unity of the world under its rule. No alternative seemed imaginable, and a new version of left melancholy emerged, mourning the end of the mythological golden age of the welfare state. Empire radically broke with this order of discourse. And this is the reason why it is a landmark work, where liberal narratives saw the exclusive agency of market economy and liberal democracy. Empire powerfully provided us with a different genealogy of globalization and empire, articulated in a new grand narrative. Yes, do not forget this. Empire is a book splendidly written and structured. The multitude, Michael and Tony write, called empire into being. In other words, it was the combined effect of workers' anti-colonial and anti-imperialist struggles in the 20th century that compelled capital to stretch its circuits of valorization and accumulation beyond the national boundaries, to become global. Antagonism crisscrossed the fabric of globalization. challenging any linear reading of the processes that were unifying the world amid conflicts and tensions. What a sense of liberation reading those pages in Empire. Far from looking in a nostalgic way at the past, the book encouraged us to look, to take those conflicts and tensions, those global antagonisms, as the generative basis for the new political practices and processes of radical transformation. And moreover, between Seattle and Genoa, a new global movement was occupying squares and streets, literally staging the antagonism of globalization. In December 2001, many of us could look at the uprisings in Buenos Aires and Argentina as a further extension of that global movement. And we started to participate in Latin American movements and politics in the following years in a very different way than in the past. And this happened also elsewhere in the world, nurturing multiple attempts to reinvent internationalism, a crucial task in the light of the analysis pursued in Empire. Independently of many critiques and heated debates, Empire had a significant influence within the global or altered globalization movement. It raised the problem that continues to haunt us, which means the need to understand the unity and at the same time the heterogeneous articulation of capital's command in the global age, investigating its political implications and the forms of its contestation. More generally, precisely because it emphasized the antagonistic nature of global processes, Empire opened a new season of studies of the global. Critical geographers and legal scholars, anthropologists and political theorists carefully mapped over the last 2 decades, not necessarily with reference to Empire, but working in the space that it had contributed to open, processes of fragmentation and heterogenization connected with the global processes, practices of struggle and resistance, regional variations of global formations like governance and neoliberalism. And while after 9/11, globalization seemed to wane from public debate in a conjuncture of US unilateralism and quote and unquote new imperialism, the global and global processes became much more interesting topics for research and political experimentations. For that matter, despite several points of criticism and discussion, my own work, and in particular the work I have been doing with Brett Nilsson over the last years, took Empire as a crucial reference. My ongoing discussion with the authors of Empire, since a review of the Italian edition I wrote in 2002 for the daily Il Manifesto, revolved over a few topics. Among them figure a certain straightforward interpretation of the transition to Empire, the persisting tensions between politics and capital that are at times obscured in the book by the emphasis on the emergence of a new capitalist sovereignty, and the way in which borders are discussed in Empire, in the framework of what the authors call the smooth space of Empire. I will not delve into these topics today, first of all, because Michael and Tony dealt with them in what seems to me a much more interesting and productive way in their later works, and in particular in Commonwealth. But I wanted to mention them because they seem to me symptomatic of the age in which empire was written, which means the 1990s. Just think of the position of the United States in the framework of what I consider to be one of the most productive notions of the book, the mixed constitution of empire. Sure, a crucial and original aspect of the analysis pursued in the book is that empire, despite many misunderstandings, is not identified with the United States. Nevertheless, Michael and Tony write, I quote, at the narrow pinnacle of the pyramid of the mixed constitution, there is one superpower, the United States, that holds hegemony over the global use of force, a superpower that can act alone, but prefers to act in collaboration with others under umbrella. Tony, chiudi il microfono per cortesia. Grazie. Under the umbrella of the United Nations. So even leaving aside the reference to the United Nations in the quote, the hegemonic position of the United States was taken for granted. Importantly, it was not considered the hegemony of an imperialistic power, but rather of a superpower immersed in the complex fabric of empire. And this gives the notion of mixed constitution a flexibility that allows adaptation to the multiple shifts that have shaped the world order and disorder over the last 2 decades. But there is a need to acknowledge that today the position of the United States is much more problematic and even elusive than one reads in Empire. Even today, when President Biden attempts to relaunch multilateralism and to lead an enlarged West, he is fully aware of the fact that such West is just a part of the globe, compelled to face multiple strategic and competitive challenges. Again, this is a point that Michael and Tony registered in later works, particularly in a section of Commonwealth entitled After US Hegemony, where among other things you can find a more nuanced discussion of the work of Giovanni Arrighi, who was the first to speak of a crisis of US global hegemony in the 1990s. I am convinced that the notion of mixed constitution of empire continues to provide us with effective analytical tools to come to terms with the tumultuous transformations that shape the present global conjuncture and that are intensified and multiplied by the COVID-19 pandemic. One could say that one of the most influential works on the political and legal aspects of globalization that came out after Empire, Authority, Territory, Rights by Saskia Sassen, nicely fits the framework of Michael and Tony's rereading of Polybius' mixed constitution. More importantly, I would say that mixed constitutions are emerging in contradictory ways today at the regional scale, with conflicts and tensions crisscrossing each level of their articulation. Far from being a static model, the mixed constitution emerges as a framework to manage global processes precisely because of its dynamic and contradictory nature. Meanwhile, a global or imperial mixed constitution is missing, as Michael and Tony acknowledge in their recent essay for the 20th anniversary of Empire, when they speak of, I quote, two nested spheres, the planetary networks of social production and reproduction, and the constitution of global governance, that are increasingly out of sync. I think this is an important statement that opens new avenues for research on global processes and spaces in the current conjuncture. And the notion of mixed constitution, reframed and adjusted to cope with new dynamics and challenges, will continue to be helpful. Written in the 1990s, Empire provides uncanny anticipations of the present. The age of globalization, we read on page 136, is the age of universal contagion. I do not think they had the coronavirus in mind, but who knows? No kidding. The issues of contagion, miscegenation, hybridity figure prominently in the book, in particular with respect to the composition of living labor that sustains and enables what Michael and Tony call passages of production. And they shape the rethinking of the notion of multitude, quote and unquote, discovered by Tony at the beginning of the 1980s in his first book on Spinoza, and then reworked by him and several other thinkers, including Paolo Virni. I will not go into the unending discussions surrounding this notion in the wake of the publication of Empire, nor I will discuss in depth the way in which the multitude is presented in the book or in Multitude, 2004. Let me just say that the use of the phrase the multitude against the empire, with its Star Wars-like resonances as a slogan by several social movements, did not really help to advance the discussion. But maybe this is just an echo of Italian provincial controversies of the time. The multitude, Michael and Tony write toward the end of Empire, is a new proletariat and not a new working class. It would be interesting to read this statement together with the inspiring pages written by Étienne on the relations and tensions between proletariat and working class in Marx. What interests me here is precisely the relation between the notion of the multitude and the language, the concept of class. While such relation is a thread that runs through all the works by Michael and Tony, the way in which it is addressed in the recent essay I mentioned before, Empire 20 Years On, seems to me particularly challenging and interesting. And it resonates with the work I have been modestly doing for several years now on class and difference, inspired by the challenges posited by anti-racist and feminist movements in the last decade. Allow me, therefore, to conclude with some reflections on this point in view of future discussions and collaborations. As you heard before from Michael, Michael and Tony strategically alter Marx's general formula of capital, money, commodity, money, prime, and propose to think of the profound transformations of class through what they call a general formula of organization, class, multitude, class prime. The passage through the multitude inscribes heterogeneity and multiplicity onto the very constitution of class prime, not simply as factors of fragmentation, but above all, registering the panoply of struggles that address multiple regimes of oppression, ranging from racism to sexism and heteronormativity. This is the reason why class prime, Michael and Tony write, must be a multitudinous class, an intersectional class. I admire the elegancy of this argument, and I feel very close to its logic and political aim. My concluding question regards the meaning of class in class prime. Michael and Tony's references to Achille Mbembe's notion of racial class and Christine Delphi's sex class are helpful, but it seems to me that they do not fully address the specificity of class. A notion that, at least in my use, is strictly linked with an understanding of exploitation as something that cannot be reduced to oppression and domination. Class refers to a split, to a line of antagonism that crosses and divides the people, potentially establishing a political front. What about such aspects of class in class prime? Let me be clear. Such factors as sex and race are for me constitutive of class antagonism. They do not simply establish the modality in which class is lived, to use the famous words of Stuart Hall. They rather operate at the level of the fabrication of the bodies, of the bearers of labor power, and are therefore primary elements of class. Gone are once for all the days of main and secondary contradictions. Nevertheless, it is clear that movements around sex and race are not necessarily class movements. Simply put, they involve people and sectors of society who do not figure among the exploited. And rightly so. This is not a way to dismiss the relevance of those movements. The opposite is the case. Attacking crystallized and deeply rooted systems of oppression is crucial in itself, and it also has fundamental implications for the life and labor of the exploited. My question is simply, under which conditions movements against sexism, racism, heteronormativity become class movements? Under which conditions they can nurture a politics of class prime, a multitudinous class, an intersectional class? Needless to say, I do not have an answer. It is just a question that I would like to keep open for discussion and for our future work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sandro. Now it's up to you, Veronica.
Thank you very much. It is a great honor to be here for me today. Of course, the words will sound different if we were here in the flesh, but I want to thank David and Matteo for their persistence in making it happen, even when all the face-to-face plans failed. So I also want to thank all my comrades, compañeros of the panel for this celebration of the book event that was Empire. To start, I also want to say that it's not easy, at least for me, to speak of empire. There are so many ways of approaching it that I had a lot of trouble deciding where to start. Rereading the book, revisiting its polemics, seeing the large number of associated texts, interviews, reviews in which we can trace its repercussions, the historical moments with which it was associated is also an almost never-ending task. Thinking about why I couldn't come up with more defined evaluations and more drastic or polemical positions about its proclamations along the lines, for example, where its predictions met or not, where they refuted, where they changed or corrected later. Can those theses be supported in the face of the horror of the world today? I realize that is because, above all, I am very grateful for the book, for that project of shared writing, the wager of opening up a narrative for new generations of militants, and the gesture of giving themselves over the task with great generosity. So that gratitude is the first thing that I want to express. In what follows, I'm going to divide my intervention into three parts. Firstly, I will start with the scene of Empire's reading 20 years ago to concretely situate its appearance on this side of the world, particularly in Argentina. Then I will point to some key aspects that, from my perspective, make the book an inflection point as a theoretical political diagram of a first post-Cold War global communist narrative that marked the beginning of this century. Finally, I will discuss the resonances of the debates opened up by Empire today in relation to feminist political practices in which I am involved. 21 years ago, Empire was quick to circulate in Spanish thanks to an independent translation by Eduardo Sadier, which we photocopied. It would be formally published later in 2002 by Paidós. The timely translation reveals not only the local voracity in circulating written text, perhaps in the series of the Buenos Aires typographers Engels spoke to Marx about, but also a desire for a political conversation. And the timing is no minor detail. Between the hand-to-hand circulation of those photocopies and their distribution in bookstores, there was the crisis that would change Argentina forever, and in which the hypothesis of autonomy deployed by the anti-neoliberal revolt would also be marked by the debate about empire. I want to emphasize the fact that in Argentina, the book is inscribed, or better yet, was embedded in and taken up by the very unique political cycle that began with the crisis in 2001 and would rapidly become part of a regional sequence of uprisings in which popular movements of the unemployed, factories taken over by workers, neighborhood assemblies, and so on, would develop a new type of social protagonism and also have an immediate global repercussion. To sum up, the book is read and is in dialogue with an insurrection that, more than anything, deploys a destituent force against the neoliberal austerity of the Washington Consensus, and that in its expression on the streets, overflows pre-existing organizations, defies theories available to make sense of it, opening up question about the novelty of certain political forms, and particularly the reinvention of the efficacy of struggles in the 21st century. As part of Colectivo Situaciones, at that time, I can add something else to the scene in which it was read, which coalesces or condense it as fluid history. Our personal encounter with Toni Negri in Rome, where we interviewed him that very year. That conversation was later published in a book titled Counterpower, an introduction, which also disseminates some of the hypotheses of empire. The interview also functioned as a pamphlet summary of the book, intervening in the debates and reading of the crisis in real time. Empire, beyond its complete reading, the rumors or the talk about it through reviews or comments, became a watershed moment for renewing the projection of a militant Marxism in a series of the rupture opened by the Zapatista insurgency and their proposal of autonomy from the south of Mexico to the world. At the same time, empire entered into a constellation with concrete events that took place around the time it was launched. The book seemed to be heard, not only read, as a soundtrack in Seattle, Porto Alegre, Genoa, Buenos Aires, to name just a few places. The simultaneity between the book's appearance and ongoing social revolt in the case of Argentina therefore gave it a specific impact, situated it within an open interpretation and popularized it, giving it a conjunctural importance in which the debate was not only textual. The book would live on in the following Latin American conjuncture of the cycle of progressive governments, with the Tony and Michael travels and several visits to Argentina, Bolivia, Venezuela, and Brazil. More than a treatise, which it resembles, or a manual, which was also classified as, I think that empire might be better characterized as a synoptic machine. Its chapters revise and update the legal, political, economic, technological, subjective dynamics that structure global command and that intersect to produce a plane that is both historical and that covers the whole. Empire became unavoidable because its ambition did not go unnoticed, to become a manifesto of global theory and action. It not only makes a diagnosis, but also proposes a revolutionary subject and deepens a debate in terms of what is to be done. It drew out the consequences of what had been transformed in relation to the dynamics of the world system after 1989 and sought to construct a grammar that would enable us to account for the new order and not only the disintegration of the prior one. It takes up Marxist class analysis, especially that of the Grundrisse, along with the mutations shown in 1000 Plateau, by explicitly bringing together that pretense of systematization, of a total theory, with postmodern philosophies, and with the reiterated use of that word, postmodern, which today already sounds outdated, it produces a clash that is both what made it effective and what gave rise to all types of polemics. In that sense, one of the most daring elements of the book is its attempt to replace the theory of imperialism. I would say, however, that it did something different, or that we learned from it was something different. It revealed the need for a revision of theories of imperialism. It forced people to make pronouncement about it. The passage from imperialism to empire was, more than anything, criticized for diluting the evident preponderance of certain powers that are still concentrated in national states, as well as being imbued by a narrative that would seem progressive in terms of a Marxism that retains faith in the development of productive forces, additionally associated with a dominant pattern of biopolitical production. Some of us prefer to read it as an overlap rather than an overcoming, and that therefore the images of the spoke of finding the first work in the third and the third word in the first world metropolis made more sense than directly throwing out the whole schema. Tony and Michael are explicit about the fact that their genealogy of empire is restricted to an Eurocentric or Euro-Atlantic geography, which is, without that, insufficient for a genealogy. Even so, it collaborates with the revitalization of that debate by once again foregrounding the dimension of the world market and its political order. Empire progressively became not only a book, but also a corpus of debates that, besides being continued in a series, Multitude, Commonwealth, Assembly, enters into a constellation with another series of texts and polemics that deprovincialize it. But the questions that remains open, as they themselves remark in their text about the book 20 years on, is that of new internationalism. Perhaps the point on which many critics of the book agree, and which has been specially emphasized, is the book optimism, argued in several ways. Here, I would dare to say that it's an error of interpretation, which is not the exact term, even in the critique. Empire's maneuver, that is also made it like a millstone, is that it proposes the operaista method as a way of reading the world, in such a way that the thesis elaborated in the heat of the 60s and 70s about and from the class struggle in Italy and their impact on the relationship between living labor and capital are projected as global theses which prefigure what would later be analyzed as post-Fordism. With this scale leap, they put a theoretical, current, and political hypothesis to the test to create a general theoretical structure. That operaísmo and optimism, it doesn't function in English, operaísmo and optimismo in Spanish, have a certain homophonic similarity is a coincidence. But what comes into play with enormous force is the explanation that the making of the world arises from struggles, that labor's composition takes different historical forms that shape the possibility of rejecting capital's synthesis through the political practice of sabotage. That the microscopic diffusion of rebellious behavior condensed as collective subjectivity, modifying what is desired, what is believed possible, and even reinventing proletarian bodies. The materiality of the thesis that sustains the autonomy of labor power, its capacity to become autonomous from the command of capital, disseminates the formula that labor comes first and the logic of capital, adjusting the metaphor of the vampire, comes behind. This does not necessarily lead to optimism. It does not claim victory, but it does recognize the preeminence of struggles, even in the most aggressive and expropriating moments of the becoming finance of capitalism. We hold on to this principle that is the basis of the constituent power, because it is the lesson that empire spreads, and because it enters into dialogue, if you will, with a way of reading under the radar, of making audible what is not heard in the majority of analysis that make capitalist realism into the final syntax of what happens. Of course, this general premise is not a magical formula that resolves everything. Additionally, despite adopting a perspective of the Foucauldian microphysics of power and a Deleuzian perspective for describing the shift to society of control, the authors do not avoid a theory of the state. And later, in conjunctural debates, the question would return again and again to elaborate a theory of institutions that would also be capable of bringing it together in relation to struggles, and even of thinking about the different forms of the relation between movements and governments. But that principle is projected again at the global level, to recognize the effects and responses to revolutionary internationalist dynamics, to the moments of communism and the expansiveness of the masses in capital's restorative offensives. This principle even continues persisting today when the violence of this sequence is exacerbated to the point of avoiding all mediation and moments of negotiation, when the destruction of rents as a direct mechanism of government becomes clear with all its violence. Then, what I want to say is that this formula would allow for bringing the thesis of empire together with other theories, especially those emerging from other parts of the world, that historically made the effort to highlight political dynamics where usually only domination and oppression were seen. To close, I want to think about some questions related that door that empire opened and to a certain degree are clearly outlined in assembly as its counterpart. I do so, as I said at the beginning, situated in conversation with the feminist struggles in which I participate. The political intervention of feminism in a region in movement like Latin America relaunched the question about the dynamics of organicity between popular feminist and anti-racist movements and forms of government. It does so on the plane of organization and strategy. In that register, it experiments with forms of feminist unionism, a way of organizing demands, taking seriously how feminism has expanded the concept of labor and putting the spotlight on social reproduction. Feminist diagnostics about the pauperization of wage, domestic, migrant working conditions under accelerated processes of precarization that had been shown to be the most accurate in the pandemic, expanded the notion of labor and developed union-based strategies for intervening in that expansion. In the same way, we see a pragmatic capacity to combine demands for public resources from the state with dynamics of self-management that guarantee their implementation. All of this once again situates the question of how the empirical reality of class composition, even without using the language of class, finds a political expression and forms of practical intervention. This question had been put to the test at the general level in the international feminist strike that, in its 5th consecutive year, has shaped a process that is becoming more complex, that requires sustaining transversal coordination each time, and that marks a lasting event in the history of the recent cycle of mass feminism at the national and transnational level. It has established a global date that, in each place, makes it so that the date simultaneously expresses an internationalist experience without sacrificing the specificities of each conjuncture. It is constructed as a political process and therefore as an accumulation of forces that proposes an agenda, deepens debates, subverts obedience, and whips horizons. The meanings enabled by the feminist strike, the conquest that it pursues, are linked to struggles historically related to labor and living conditions of the majorities that are updated today to account for the forms taken by labor as generalized precarity and the tasks that are constantly rendered invisible and naturalized for certain bodies and certain territories. Here, I also want to bring up the problematization made by a programmatic line that has taken the name as a feminist program against the precarization of life that is now underway. Finally, against the opposition of identity versus class, or the thematic of power versus the thematic of exploitation that is often used to attempt to label current struggles, feminist revolts verbalize, mobilize, and spread a change in the working classes, define its classification and hierarchy. but especially putting a requirement of transversality into play. This opens up the questions both about a practical form of connection and composition of conflicts, and a reformulation of how exploitation is articulated in the triangle between capital, patriarchy, and colonialism, which becomes increasingly clear in the extractive orientation of neoliberal capital. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronica. Thank you for your presentation and your reflections. And now, Étienne, it is up to you.
Yes, thank you. Okay, I will be short because we've already heard a number of important ideas and, I would say, provocations for a debate from the three speakers. And also because I will confess this right away, quite different from my friends and colleagues and predecessors. I'm not coming with a written presentation. I'm coming with a bundle of handwritten notes, which of course I will push aside, otherwise it would become impossible, that I prepared more or less overnight after returning with enormous pleasure, I would say, and excitement to this great, extraordinary book, to which, of course, we know that we ought to add the whole series that derives from it and develops its core ideas or modifies them, of course, sometimes in relatively important respects, because the others, well, I once wrote somewhere that a great philosopher, or more generally a great author, never writes the same thing twice. This could be used also as a negative criterion if you have somebody or people, and this is quite frequent, who endlessly rewrite the same book. You can be sure that this is not a great significant contribution to theory. So of course they evolved, and in the principle, and this has been also demonstrated by allusions in the previous talks, and better than anything in Michael's own presentation. Incidentally, I understand from Sandro's intervention that you have published something recently, Michael, with Tony, that is a kind of retrospective evaluation, etc. Perhaps our organizers could send us, circulate a reference, because I have to confess that I couldn't see it. Okay, so you did show beautifully that this work is a work in continuous progress, adapting to the new circumstances, to the interpellations, as we might say, of the actuality and contemporary history. And of course, this is one of the most obvious indications of the power and the value and the creativity, the virtuality of this book. Now, what I did myself, and what I will explain now in a short time, was returning to empire, specifically because of one question that is central in the book, and I'm intrigued by the fact that, in a sense, the word that names it, which is really, if you reread the book, absolutely central. And it's the key to the genealogy the grand narrative that Veronica has referred to. And of course, it's implicit in many of the remarks that have just been made. Nevertheless, was not pronounced. This name is sovereignty. And of course, I believe that I myself and many others, this is not a critique. This is just a kind of attempt at reading something like symptom in our discussion. And of course, we have many reasons to be interested in the question of sovereignty in general. What do we mean by that? Which kind of definition are we using? Are we adopting? Which kind of precisely genealogy or critical history of the problem are we proposing? And the two dramatic events, at least I would say, which form the background, unexpectedly in a sense, or for our conversation today with all their differences. It's already a problem to try and bring them together in a single appreciation of the conjuncture. On the one side, the COVID-19 pandemic and its development into a general or global crisis, which at the same time is a crisis of a new kind. It's certainly not a repetition of any previous crisis, not even the most recent one 10 years ago. And on the other side, and I have to, I'm sure we're all in the same mood in this respect, that is devastated what is taking place in Palestine these days again. And it's worsening hour by hour. So all the these two events, of course, immediately call for a new reflection on the issue of sovereignty, although in very different manners. Now, what I assume, and I offer for discussion, of course, and particularly asking Michael, I know that Tony is hiding somewhere behind a letter J on this screen, and that he's not willing to actively contribute to the discussion, and I respect that. But let me tell you, Tony, in passing, also that's part of my improvisation, that I had hoped so dearly, with such profound desire, that the occasion of this discussion of your book with Michael would be finally an occasion for us all to gather physically in person and give us a hug, and this is not possible, and that makes me extremely sad, I have to say. But I know you're here. So the interpretation that I offer very tentatively is that there are problems with there are deep problems with the use of the category that, like it or not, is the central category in empire. And please don't misunderstand me. What I'm saying here is not that this would be something like a weakness of the book, or something in the book that would have proved more or less quickly to be outdated or impossible to maintain. It is not the case, in fact, that right after writing Empire, Tony and Michael dropped or brushed aside, I would say, this central interest and preoccupation for the question of sovereignty and the category of the sovereign. It is rather the case, I believe, that they started to re-elaborate, in fact, some of its dimensions, certain and they progressively, which I not only agree with, but in a sense like very much and approve. And today's discussion shows why it's important to I'd say more or less completely shift the interest towards the other category, the one that seems to be antithetic to sovereignty, and therefore, but we'll come to that, to empire, namely the category of the multitude, or as Michael has said today very clearly, the idea of the organic multiplicity, I would say, of the forces that resist capitalist sovereignty, and therefore built as a constituent power the alternative. So they put the stress on the emphasis on the alternative, and they're working on that. But something must remain dependent, in a sense, from the starting point. And in a sense, the question I'd gladly ask in general, as not as a personal question, is it would be something like, to what extent has your understanding of the question of the multitude and the posse, I mean the power, the force of the multitude become more or less completely independent from its original or originary coupling and almost binary, I would say, articulation with the question of the of sovereignty. Could you, in a sense, my answer is probably no, but I want to possibly hear you about that. Now, keep developing a discourse on this multiple creativity, or this force of alternative, based on contemporary experiences and new theoretical inventions, leaving aside, in a sense, or neutralizing the question of sovereignty and the sovereign. Now, from this point of view, Davide and Matteo cut me after 20 minutes max. So returning to the constellation, I would say, or the series of the books and their progressive development, something struck me, which I also want to put into question or to bring into the discussion, which is the fact that if you look at multitude, and here I have the French translation, but you will forgive me if I sometimes oscillate between different languages. The center is on the question of war. The book is centered on the question of the global war. And of course, between the question of sovereignty, or imperial sovereignty, more precisely, in the sense that they gave to the term, and the question of the global war, there is an intimate connection. And of course, here something else must be present in our minds, which has to do with the conjuncture, a word that has been pronounced here several times. Something happened between the publication, the elaboration of Empire, and the elaboration and publication of Multitude 4 years later, which was 9/11 and the launching of the so-called war on terror, which is the concrete reference, or the main concrete reference, I would say, of the book Multitude. But if you look at it, even just using the table of contents as a guiding thread, you will notice that the intervention of the category sovereignty is postponed until the end. This is a formal consideration, but I believe that it's not uninteresting. It's only in the very last chapter, or very last section, which is called in French la démocratie de la multitude, the democracy of the multitude, that the question of sovereignty returns. It returns. It's explicitly mentioned in the form of a discussion, very substantial, quick but very substantial discussion of the relationship between sovereignty and democracy, and the so-called two faces of democracy. So allow me to suggest, with a quick short circuit, that this bears the trace of a long tradition, of a long theoretical tradition, Marxist, or even more precisely, perhaps Marxist-Leninist tradition, within which Tony Negri and Michael Hardt are consciously working, of course, from a deviant or subversive or critical point of view. And this tradition, I will not expand on that, but I would summarize by just asking the question: for how long will we remain imaginarily, I would say, or intellectually in the situation of 1917? Because the problem that is looming behind that is, of course, the problem of the extent to which the revolutionary transformation of the revolutionary movement, of the revolutionary capacity to change the world, in a sense, represents a form of sovereignty that is even more absolute than the sovereignty of the state or the sovereignty of the capital. And why is it even more absolute? Because it shares with the sovereignty of the state or the sovereignty of capital. We'll have to return to that. The formal characteristic on which, remarkably, both Lenin and Carl Schmitt insisted exactly in the same moment, and in fact for the same reason, returning to the theological, political, the great theological, political legacy of the Middle Ages and the early modernity, namely the idea that the sovereign is above the law, and for that reason is released from dependency and subjection to the law. It makes the law, or it makes possible the change, the radical change in the law, but it is not subjected to it. And Marxism is haunted, I believe, undoubtedly, by the idea that the essence of the revolution is a shift, is a displacement, whereby the sovereign power changes place in the great social and historical antagonism, leaving, in a sense, one class or being destroyed, if you like, on the side of the bourgeois and capitalist class domination, and re-emerging on the other side. And of course, what I'm saying here, and I will conclude because probably I'm at the end now, what I'm saying here is not that Michael and Tony are once again I would say, repeating that. But I'm also, on the contrary, I believe that they are looking consciously and very explicitly for a different way of formulating the alternative. Namely, on one side, and here somebody said, I believe it was Sandro or perhaps Veronica or perhaps you, Michael, I don't remember now, Sandro, I believe, that immediately after the publication of Empire, a kind of mantra or a simplistic political imagery, I would say, had soon emerged and become repeated everywhere. The conflict, the two camps are empire on one side and multitude on the other side, creating a kind of symmetry that precisely is to be avoided. But I believe that the problem, it seems to me that their problem was and became even more when they, after 9/11, they wrote Multitude, the problem of thinking, of imagining, of conceptualizing an alternative force, movement, etc., to the domination and the exploitation synthetically called empire, that at the same time would represent the alternative, the democratic alternative, if you like, to the classical idea of reversing the sovereign power, or having the genuine sovereign. Which is, but democracy, like it or not, the name says it, has a relationship to people. One of the mottos of the themes of empire is the multitude is not the people. The multitude is not, the people is the name that the multitude is given or is imposed when it is caught in the fabric, in the construction of the sovereign nation state. Therefore, the negations accumulate. Let's talk of democracy, and they have extensively described these democratic forms, and I completely agree with that. Avoiding articulating the idea of democracy with an idea of the people in general. That's a problem, because the idea of the people might bring back the fatal symmetry, as Stuart Hall talks of a fatal triangle, the fatal symmetry between the sovereign and the revolution. And of course, what's interesting here, I would want to talk about that, but that can come back in the come later, perhaps in the discussion, is the extremely precise and articulated way and powerfully conceptually constructed argument in empire. This is not just wishful thinking. We want another idea of the revolutionary movement or the transformation. It's based on more than a grand narrative. It's based on a construction. But the center, and I end with that, the center of that great construction is also what for me remains the most problematic in the book. And the more I read it, the more I am puzzled and embarrassed. And of course, this is the idea that sovereignty is a traveling notion. It's a traveling institutional and conceptual form. Therefore, there are stages. But the central stage, so it begins, even with the Romans, it's Eurocentric. I agree with you, Veronica. No Chinese empire, no. Whether the Chinese today are pure and simply occupying again the position of the hegemon in the Eurocentric sense, or they will at some point impose on us a completely different representation of global power or empire. This is open. But in any case, it begins before and it continues after. After what? After the articulation of the nation state as the central monopolistic organization of power and the imperialist policies of the 19th century, whose binding thread, whose connecting element is, of course, the history of capital. But if you accept their description, the axiom becomes, we are now beyond that moment. We are beyond that structure. Imperialism belongs to the past, and even more, the nation state belongs to the past. And I, like so many internationalists, communists, cosmopolitans maybe, etc., have dreamt all my life, in a sense, have been desperately hoping that this would be the case. That this would be the case. Not only that we are struggling to overcome the xenophobic, racist, narrow-minded, exploitive, administrative, blah blah functions of the nation state, but we can do that because we have in our back, so to speak, or behind us, a powerful historical trend that overcomes the nation state. And the nation state is reborn every day before our eyes. Now, I'm not saying this is wrong, but I say this is highly problematic. So that behind the problem that I wanted to raise of how to keep referring to sovereignty while at the same time providing a radical alternative, there's another difficulty, enigma, if you like. What is that? The nation state. And as Marxists or post-Marxists, we have a very strong tendency to believe that the nation as the class, in a sense, are the two typical social formations, I will say social forms, of the capitalist era. But we, in fact, probably will need to reopen that case. And I don't say that empire is not helping us to do it. Probably it is, but of course, and that's also why it is a great book, it's not sufficient.
Thank you, Étienne. Michael, I don't know, do you want maybe to reply to other speakers' thoughts?
Yeah, I thought I'm very grateful, and I thought rather than actually reply, I just wanted to pull some things together that I found very interesting. I mean, one, all three of you were talking in some ways about the development of the project after Empire and the way Tony and I had written things afterwards, and it occurs to me that there are three ways in which the writing developed since then. I mean, one is because of events, like Étienne mentioned with the war, the U.S. Global war on terror, occupation of Iraq, etc. The second is really a more important one. This is what Sandro and Veronica were both talking about, is about movements. You know, how movements. Yeah, this is something I admire so much in both Sandro's and Veronica's work, is the way that you're able to think on the basis of movements, like do theory through with the kind of collective reflection that happens within assemblies, within movements, and that's indeed something that Tony and I strive to. And the third is the matter that when I think back to the different books, there's a process of learning. I mean, some of it is from events, but some of it is just me and Tony learning about things that we didn't know before. I mean, for instance, in Commonwealth, there's a reflection on race and coloniality that we developed, that we learned. And so it's not as so much that the times changed, but partly we changed too, or entered into things. Anyway, that was just a reflection on the sort of developing project that became clear to me in that. one of the things that might be an interesting connection is Étienne's questions about sovereignty that seem very interesting and right to me, is putting those together with something that Veronica mentioned almost in passing, that rather than seeing empire as a theory about the end of imperialism, it's rather a revision of theories of imperialism, which seems to go together with the reflections on sovereignty that, and the problems, that Étienne was posing with the persistence of the nation state. You know, in some ways, Veronica's generous way of reading it is, even when we say imperialism is over, Michael and Tony don't really mean that. What they really mean is we have to view it differently. And that's somewhat, I think that's somewhat related to the problematic that Étienne is posing. I guess here's a more difficult problem that I see you posing, Étienne, to which I don't have an immediate response. I mean, those of you who know me, my tendency when someone makes a criticism is always to agree with them. That's always my first instinct. And then later I come back to thinking what I really think. But my first instinct is to go with you. So Étienne, when you pose, this seems very interesting to me. To what extent has the understanding of multitude, to what extent can that become independent of our understanding of the forces of power, empire, sovereignty, etc.? And I do think that it's part of the relation to operaismo, or even this relationship to contemporary struggles that I was just mentioning, that there is the methodological attempt to read resistance prior to power, or read struggles as generating the condition, and that reading power as a response to them, rather than giving the priority to forms of power and domination, and reading struggles as responses to that. I would like to, though, be able to. I mean, it's not that I don't think. I agree with you, Étienne, too. That and Sandro mentioned this too. That if one looks through the different books, we seem to become less. We devote less space to reading the structures of global sovereignty or empire, and devote much more space to trying to work out the conditions of possibility of an alternative. But that doesn't. Sandro, you also raise a super difficult question about class, and you may be totally right. You're posing class. In order for us to talk about class prime, or try to reconfigure radically an understanding of class that doesn't rely, like I was saying, on the struggles against capital as its center of gravity. You know, understanding of a class as working class, but understanding of class instead as a multiplicitous form of organization. And here class, I think I'm thinking of class at a more, I'm thinking of class as an institution of counterpower. So something that allows for the relationship to capital, but also equally the relationship to other structures of domination. I mean, that's why I thought when Tony and I referred to certain feminist practices in the 1980s, Christine Delphi was an example, but there are US examples too about that. So thinking they're trying to think sex class as a concept, you know, in a way not unrelated to capital, but class as a formation of struggle against patriarchy. Why can't we think class in a more open way? It could be I'm totally deluded in trying to revise class that dramatically, and that even if it were conceptually coherent, people would always misunderstand it as always another returning back to the notion of working class. But let me just say that Sandro, you say something very precise, and this is what I can't respond to, which is that you're proposing that class always relates to, or necessarily relates to, a notion of exploitation rather than oppression, and that's part of the challenge of what I was trying to formulate, or a problem that what I was trying to formulate would have to overcome. And that's great. Just something I have to think about. Yeah, maybe I'll. Those are. I mean, I'm just trying to highlight. I guess one last thing with Veronica is where you end, which is something that I totally admire in your recent writings. The book, of course, is part of that. The notion of a feminist program against the precarity of life as a way of confronting the triangle of capital, patriarchy, and coloniality that's exactly the kind of project that it seems that I'm trying to, how to say? I'm trying to not recognize, create, to think of the ways in which these projects can coincide, or the ways that they would have to transform in order to be able to engage what you're proposing, which seems to me a central struggle of our age. So that's what I'm trying to work in that direction, and in some ways, Sandro's question is one about whether, to the extent to which that's possible, I guess, or what are the obstacles in order to address that. I guess with this last part, I was just reading ways, and maybe you all would have better ways of saying it, is that reading what you had already prepared previously without my first attempted intervention as critiques of what I was saying, even without having known what I was going to say. And I think you're right in the critiques, and so that's what I'm trying to think through. The possibilities, yeah, like I said, of a transformation of the notion of a political multiplicity that we had developed 20 years ago in ways that I think engage or need to engage the prominent forms of struggle today. Yeah, I'll stop with that. I realize these sort of responses, I'm never particularly coherent enough in grasping what others. So I should stop and go with, yeah. Well, you, Davide, what do you think to go now with Sandro, Étienne, and Veronica, or should we open to others?
I don't know if Sandro, Veronica, and Étienne want to react very shortly, so that after you we can open a debate with the audience.
I think we should open the debate with the audience, and maybe later we can have a final word.
Excuse me, I'll leave for 2 minutes but I'll be back.
Yes, so if any of you would like to share his or her thoughts or ask questions, please go. You just have to raise your hands, or if anyone prefers to post questions, the chat should be accessible now.
Can I make a question?
Yes, of course.
Yes. I would like to ask Michael, what is the relationship of empire with the work you did on the labor of Dionysius? Because usually we tend to associate empire with multitude and commonwealth, but that book is a little bit forgotten, perhaps, in your trajectory, while I think it's very important in the rethinking of the state. So how you shift from the perspective of the state in postmodern times to that of global sovereignty that you analyzed in Empire. What was the intellectual trajectory in those few years? Thanks.
Davide, I'll respond right away. I'm not sure I can reconstruct that movement, but you're right. That's an interesting move, that even relating to Étienne's question about sovereignty, where earlier we were trying to work through the questions of the state form, and that in Empire we were posing it at a global level. I should say something about that earlier book, the Labor of Dionysus, was how it came about was a U.S. editor asking that Tony collect essays he'd written about the state mostly in the 1970s, which Tony's response, as I remember it, I think Tony's lurking here, he can correct me, but Tony's response, as I remember it, was, well, that would just be boring. Why don't we write something that confronts now the question of the state and continues those essays? So in English, that book appeared as a combination thing of essays just written by Tony in the 70s, and then our attempts in an introduction into later chapters of the 90s. So in some ways, you could even read its conjuncture as you were posing it as from the 70s to the 90s, and hence that a confrontation with that relation to the state, and with the movements that had developed at the time. I mean, at the time of Labor of Dionysus, ACT UP was active in the U.S. and was part of the reflection of it, and yeah, in some ways the books reflected the nature of the movements, that by the late 1990s there were movements that also helped us think at the global scale, the Zapatistas in particular. Yeah, so I don't know how to say any more about that. I do remember at the end of Labor of Dionysus, there was a section trying to pose the prerequisites of communism, which seemed to me of interesting and lasting reflection, which in some ways I was thinking today, I was trying to work within that same framework. Thanks for it.
Thank you.
Bu, do you have a question to ask?
Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Great, thanks. So I've really appreciated the different reflections on class, but I've also noticed that there is a tendency to, when we speak of class, we mean the working class or the proletariat, or that question, that set of questions around this, or the multitude. There's also the question of the capitalist class on the other side. And in relation to this, I remember quite quickly, or a few years after Empire came out with the war in Iraq, I was inspired by the book, but I needed to find a way to think the moment, the kind of change moment. And what I thought was the best way to kind of reframe the argument of Empire would be to say it's not a description of the emerging global order. It's the description of a project of an emerging global order, which was never fully finished. And that was a project of specific actors, specific parts of the ruling class, you might say, in different countries, within different international institutions, especially in the United States. But there was a shift from the Clinton to the Bush administration in the extent to which that was prioritized. And they were definitely willing to break some of the project during the Bush years. So I was wondering how that might help us also think about this tension with not just in relation to the continuity of the nation state. Think about what capitalist interests and parts of the state elite are pursuing this. Also in relation to the emergence of the far right as a powerful force, and in relation to the concept of sovereignty, right? Because it's easy to take the concept of sovereignty in its philosophical formulation as a kind of unity of a certain order and ontologize that, whereas instead perhaps we should think about sovereignty as something that's always divided also, and they're all competing projects for sovereignty. Sorry, that's more of a comment than a question, I suppose. But just to say that this is a way for me that the book has has proved a lasting influence through this slight adjustment. I don't know if Michael, if you approve of this, but that doesn't matter to me anyways. But all right, so thanks for organizing this also to Davide.
Yeah, I think that's great. But yeah, go ahead, Davide, to more. You're right, Brew is more of a comment, but excellent.
Yeah, I think that Andrew has a question too.
Yes, thank you. First, briefly, a comment. I was fortunately able to attend the Empire 10 Years Later conference at the University of Pittsburgh a decade ago. And one thing that Michael mentioned in his keynote is that maybe one of the things that Empire did for the first 10 years was to be a target that everyone used to leverage their own criticism. And it was sort of remarkable in this way, in which many people didn't even sort of discuss the book as much as their disagreements with the book. Perhaps it's matured a bit now, and finally there's maybe even a sort of glorious reprieve in which we can sort of return and read Empire for the first time again. And I think that there's a really wonderful project to be had there. But my question comes actually from an essay that Michael, you wrote and published in 1995 that then gets folded into Empire. It's published in Social Text. It's called The Withering of Civil Society, in which you critique a Gramscian notion of society, and then, you know, ultimately politics were a revolutionary political response, first through Foucault, then Deleuze, then finally Tronti, in which you argue that capitalism is becoming imminent. And I think both as a diagnosis and a prescription, it was taking in the mid-90s the prevailing problematic for both structure or even organization would be that as capitalism becomes more imminent, that means that it tends to be more prioritizing difference and divergence and change, which is something that makes it actually quite kind to liberalism, and then makes a problem for left-leaning movements because they find themselves coinciding implicitly with capitalism. And I'm wondering if you or other commentators think that that becoming imminence and that becoming difference is still perhaps a prevailing problematic for organization, both for understanding capitalism as well as the movements that resist it, or if there's a different organizational logic that you think sort of prevails today that's replaced it. Thanks.
I guess I would just say there's just one thing, and Andrew, that's very nice about the way that the book has shifted. I suppose the way you're recounting that, I might have felt at 10 years a bit like that because it's true that, I mean, I felt this as a compliment at the time, but I was surprised, maybe even especially in Latin America, you know, maybe especially at Porto Alegre, about how violent the responses and attacks were that seemed, yeah, by even specific people that it seemed like that it was serving for different groups or different political thinking as the foil against which yes, I took as a compliment, but it seems striking, and I guess I think you're totally right that that's no longer the case. So which might be a different phase. This question about the becoming imminent of capital, or the way that capital manages to absorb or maybe co-opt forms of struggle or actual notions of difference, that seems to me completely germane. I mean, and present in the contemporary. It also might be another way of responding to Étienne, which would be the one, which is that that this is ways in which what we might have to grasp are forms of power that do not present at least in the way sovereignty had been thought, as a vertical, in some ways separate instance from the social plane. and instead recognize, whether we want to call this a different kind of sovereignty or something else, a more imminent mechanism of control. I mean, I guess at the time I was thinking very much in line with, maybe it was when I'd first read Deleuze's essay on the postscript to control societies, and I was very influenced by that. But nonetheless, I do agree with you that still remains a challenge. And I mean, there's been a long tradition of recognizing how difficult it is for anti-capitalist struggles to react to capital's malleability and ability to absorb certain differences. Okay, I'll stop there. I was thinking I could give examples if it didn't make sense, but I should stop.
Étienne,
could I just add a quick remark on this? Yes, thank you so much. Look, Michael, and I'm speaking also to everybody, of course. Please don't believe I'm trying to put the discussion entirely into the direction of this issue of sovereignty that I have raised. Of course not. But you just said something which prompts me or incites me to make a precision. You said I completely if I take your word, I completely understand and I completely agree that there is a recurrent question which has to do with the extent to which if we want to say something about movements, transformations, emancipation, revolutions, and so on, we need to more or less anchor, so to speak, or inscribe this reflection within an analysis of the structures of power. To what extent is the theory and the strategy of the multitude or of the multiplicity that tends somehow to invent and construct something we want to call communism, dependent on how we understand the structures of power. And the counter hypothesis that you bring in, and I take it very seriously, of course, as a very strong Foucauldian flavor. You said a moment ago, but is it not the case that in fact every power structure is built on pre-existing resistances, and therefore the reactive side is not on the side of the multitude, but it's on the side of power structures. That would not necessarily lead to the idea that in a given conjuncture, we may leave aside the question of how these structures of power are constructed, because of course, and Foucault would certainly agree with that, it's a permanent balance of power and therefore there is a reciprocity, etc. But my point, and I'll stop there, is the question I have in mind, or the various questions I have in mind with respect to sovereignty are not exactly the same as the question of power. At least in the tradition, in the intellectual and political tradition to which we belong, when you bring in the issue of sovereignty, you want to say something more and something else as simply power. In a sense, every idea of power is, of course, has to do with a relative structure of power. Whereas the idea of sovereignty, we are completely aware of that, brings with it something like the idea or the imagination of an absolute. And that does not inevitably lead into metaphysics. That's also part of politics. And what I was trying to say a moment, and that's something more and something else. So ought we to completely avoid anything that has to do with the absolute? And I don't believe that can be the case, and it is not the case in your writings, for at least two reasons, and I stop there. First, but they are the same in a sense. I mean, first there is the element of totality. So what's something that is extremely insistent in your first book, and it continues in the next one, is what we are trying to analyze is not just a global order extensively, but it's an order. You begin the book with "there is order in this world of a new kind." And this order combines, of course, extensive and above all intensive aspects. It touches every aspect of life in a differential manner, certainly, but equally in a sense. There's no longer an outside. You insist very, very strongly on that. So everything has to be brought under the subsumption, etc. So that's an element of absolute, like it or not, totality. And there is another one, and I stop with there, which also, of course, brings back very old and powerful, I'd say, dialectical schemes, which has to do with the negation. No political, and Schmidt is extraordinary from this point of view. He puts it in absolutely clear formulas, because he's writing immediately after the Soviet Revolution as the theorist, the would-be theorist of the emerging fascist movement. The 1923 extraordinary text on the crisis of parliamentary democracy is about that. Which of the two forces, which of the two myths, etc., which combine, I'd say, political organization with enrolling of the masses, I mean, etc., is going to destroy the other. So the element of absolute here, it's a different meaning, has to do with the capacity to annihilate the other who is also the adversary, the political other, the enemy, and so on and so on. And like it or not, there is a question which is latent in, which is explicit, in fact, in Empire, and it returns at the end of Multitude in a very interesting manner. Is it the case that Empire, as a total or global structure, is able to either neutralize or destroy or dissolve every internal opposition that might raise the specter of communism? Or is it the case that the what we call the multitude has, in fact, the capacity to annihilate this seemingly all-powerful and almighty structure? And I believe that you're continuously trying to look into that question, fighting onto, struggling on two sides. On one side, avoiding the symmetry. This is what I was trying to say a moment ago in my improvisation. And on the other side, bringing important political mediations. And the one that I find at the end of Multitude, which I didn't have the time to mention, but which in the current situation speaks to me, and I'm sure to others, very powerfully as a question, not as a solution, emerges when you say, if the dominant form in which we encounter the power of empire is this apparent total war situation, this general state of it. You even quote Agamben, but leave him aside. So it's a short-lived companionship. If it is that, does this mean, you ask the question, does this mean that the democracy we are talking about, which in a sense is nothing other than the immanent capacity or expansive capacity of the multitude, should be defined as an anti-war? And then you discuss, you say, we're not returning to pacifism, but on the other hand, of course, we are asking the democratic movement to impose certain limits. It's almost liberal. I mean, on what we may accept as form of war. It has to be defensive, etc., etc. And in the end, you define it as a war against the war. So this is marvelous, because you have the element of negation that I'm trying to, and war against the war is a possible name for a political absolute in today's situation. I mean, sorry, I'm much too long, but I did want to make this a little more precise.
Yeah, I don't know if maybe Veronica and Sandro, do you want to react shortly?
I have only just like reframing questions after listening the last interventions and also the last questions, is what kind of sovereignty produces the counterpower experiences, or what kind of experimentation of sovereignty, of what kind of type of sovereignty can produce counterpower experiences. I think that may be a question that is a way to also reframing the discussion in my terms, at least thinking, for example, in how different experiences today, when we talk about the fight against precarization of life, is also a way of naming practical appropriation of commonwealth, and how all the time in terms of a battle against property, and how this battle against property rights also allows us to map certain political practices against expropriation and appropriation of wealth. But also, I think that how we can connect this problematic of sovereignty with property. This is other question that I keep thinking about.
Yes, there are many questions that came up in the discussion, and we would need more time to discuss them. The questions posed by Étienne regarding sovereignty and nation state will haunt us in the near future. As far as I'm concerned, I was always convinced that sovereignty and nation state were not going to disappear in the global age. But of course, sovereignty and nation state are not transhistorical concepts and structures. They mutate. and over the last decades, they mutated in a dramatic way and many times. So I think we have to focus our attention on those mutations and on the relations between those mutations and operations of capital, while keeping in mind that in this relation between sovereignty and capital, also struggles, resistance play crucial role. Sovereignty and nation state are mutating again in the framework of the COVID-19 pandemic. Just think of the question of the vaccine that was deeply nationalized. And in this nationalization and securitization of vaccines and more generally medical supply chains, hierarchies between states became once again clear. At the same time, we have to acknowledge that even medical products that became so important in these months depend on global processes. The UK was very successful in the vaccination campaign, but that success was largely predicated on production in India. Vaccines became part of global politics, and we are witnessing today a vaccine diplomacy at the global level. And this vaccine diplomacy is transforming global relations of power. In general, I think that we should look at the persistence and mutations of sovereignty and nation states, keeping in mind that nowadays we are confronted with global processes that put severe limits on sovereignty and nation states. Just think of logistics, that is today a real global power that is not limited to managing the mobility of commodities. It generates forms of governance. It produces a space that exists in tension with the geopolitical space organized around the norm of the nation state. Or think of digital platforms. Digital platforms today deploy governmental effects. Governmental effects in the sense of the Foucauldian definition of government as conduct of conduct. And this kind of blurs the boundary between, let's say, economy and politics, contributing to further transforming the nation state and sovereignty. I would need much more time to expand on this point, but it was precisely thinking on such questions that in my presentation before I tried to revise the notion of mixed constitution. And I was trying to say that sovereignty and nation states are increasingly part of mixed constitutions in the plural. I think this is a line of inquiry we should follow in the future, also because on these developments, something very important for us depends, which means the possibility of using state structures for the purpose of advancing a project of communist transformation. So sovereignty and nation states mutate, they appear to be more fragmented than in the past, but then they are no less lethal, as we see in these days in Gaza, but also to remain to Europe in the Mediterranean Sea. A last note, very quick, on the question of class. I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm not at all proposing a return to a traditional notion of class. I'm simply stressing the fact that in order to use the concept of class, we need to link it with a theory of exploitation. I don't know how such a theory should look like today. I don't know which kind of relations we have to imagine between exploitation, oppression, domination. These are all open questions. And I think that we should continue to work in the kind of space that these questions foreshadow. And this is also because this is a space that is also traversed, qualified by powerful struggles in many parts of the world.
Could I, Davide, make, I just wanted to, I was just thinking across the recent interventions, and I'm wondering if I could make one, if it makes sense to make one distinction between, I'm totally in agreement with the question about the persistence of the nation state, the persistence of forms of sovereignty. Sandro's wonderful explaining them and their mutations, and that all, it's not that concerns me so much, but I think it's a separate question, or I would like it to be a separate question about the projects of liberation. And so this is something I see in a completely different way, I think, than Schmidt and Lenin thinking, which is that that I think, and this is when Veronica, you just posed the question about the relationship between a form of sovereignty and the notion of counterpower in struggle. In the same way that I think today, one cannot think liberation in terms of the nation state, the forms of national liberation that were key in much of the 20th century, especially anti-colonial struggles. In that same way, I think that sovereignty cannot be a key to forms of liberation today. I think we have to think, this is the harder part that I'm not sure I can do briefly, or maybe I do it all, but that we have to think about non-sovereign institutions. I mean, I think that sovereignty itself is a form of domination that we cannot redeploy in a mode of liberation. That statement, I know, requires the kind of work that Étienne was proposing, which is to understand, or at least develop further, the concept of sovereignty, to say that. And then what would be these non-sovereign institutions? I mean, I think the assembly form itself in many of the struggles today is functioning as a non-sovereign institution, as a democratic institution, or experimenting with democratic forms of decision-making and organization, which seem to me in non-sovereign terms. So I realize, I'm hesitating and I'm saying this because I'm realizing that to make coherence of the discussion, one has to develop these concepts further so that one isn't speaking across one another. But I guess what I'm generally, though, thinking is that one can, or even must, in my mind, separate that reasoning about sovereignty and about the nation state in relation to the forms of power and the possibilities of liberation, which seem to me necessarily non-homologous or non-different, have to be radically different, of course. And then part of, for me, what's marking that radical difference is partly through a development of the concept of democracy. Second, a refusal of sovereignty, refusal of representation as a concept, refusal of mediation, refusal of dialectical frameworks. These are all parts of, I recognize as part of the coordinated attempt to think of liberation outside of that framework. Yeah, and so for me, and maybe it's a conceptual, like I said, a conceptual problem that makes us speak past each other. That has to involve an abolition of sovereignty. Okay, I'm not sure if I'm making enough sense in these telegrammatic shorthand ways of posing it, but that's something I was thinking through the recent interventions.
Yeah, you have already partly answered, but if I may prolong a little bit this debate on sovereignty, totality, and counterpower liberation, I had a question for the speakers, all of you, because not only today, but more generally in your works, you insist a lot, on the one side, as you have said, on the concept of multiplicity and articulation, so mixed constitution, multitudinous class, the multiplication of labor, border as method to analyze the spatial-temporal complexity of contemporary capitalism, but also you, Veronica, you use the concept of, the heterogeneous composition of labor is for you made visible by the feminist strike, and also you work around the concept of political transversality. And Étienne, it is important for you the concept of anthropological differences and the variety of political institutional assemblies and so on. And all of you have also recently addressed more or less directly the importance of rethinking counterpower. So in assembly and in the politics of operations, counterpower, as you have just said, Michael, is thought of as a non-sovereign institution, and in terms of subversive or expansive reformism. So beyond the rigidity dichotomy that opposes reform and revolution. And in 8 theses on feminist revolution, you develop a thesis on counterpower, where it's thought of as a dynamic of spreading and weaving power in the territories, so achieving rights with a radical horizon. And Étienne, very recently, too, you mentioned counterpower and the paper on yellow vests. And if I'm not mistaken, also in the second one appeared last summer on AOC about how the pandemic pushes us to rethink the relationship between public and common in a different way. So I would ask you a couple of questions. If and why it is important to anchor a theory of counterpower on analysis hinged around concepts such as those of multiplicity, heterogeneity, and difference. I would ask you then whether and how, in your view, counterpower can be taught across and beyond national borders, and finally, if it could be taught also within and against the state, or only outside in alternative, or outside and against the state, so pushing pressure on it.
We can collect some questions. There is Elia.
Hi. Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you, Matteo and Davide, for this meeting, and thank you all for your precious contribution. I have 2 questions for Michael. The first one is this one. There are a lot of critiques which have been incorrectly addressed to empire, and the main one probably concerns the role of the state within contemporary global capitalism, as it is already said this afternoon. Many authors, it seems to me, that have not really understood what you and Tony was saying in Empire, and yet 21 years later, in the context of the pandemic, precisely this issue, along with the one of, let's say, the digitalization of production, has shown its strength and relevance. And yet in the intellectual and public debate, there still remain the idea of a deglobalization. So the question is, what do you think about the possibility of a deglobalization in the context of the pandemic? And the second question regards the temporality of your framework. Someone thought that you and Tony's use of the relationship between real and formal subsumption and the idea of, let's say, a transition from imperialism to empire could reproduce a linear, somehow teleological theory of history in which history is conceived as a succession of stages. I think this is another miscomprehension of Empire's argument. It's not true. For in Empire, we see that the process described works precisely through that complexity and heterogeneity which Sandro, Mezzadra, and others was talking about before. So it seems to me that as regards this issue of temporality, the complexity of the analysis becomes more and more clear in your later works, especially in Commonwealth, in which is more clear. I think this is a crucial political issue, and I was wondering how the reflection on temporality and history, on the temporality of history, has shaped your work in and after Empire. Thank you.
We have 2 more questions in the chat, and I propose that we can do a last round of reactions. Michael, Sandro, Étienne, Veronica.
Could you, Matteo, read the questions from the chat, please?
Yeah.
The question is, thank you so much for all the talks and discussion. To go back to the question of sovereignty again, I have a question to Michael Hardt in relation to his last comment, if I may. What about the third world and the post-socialist and post-colonial countries where very often national sovereignty is a way of counter-resistance for the local people against global capitalist power and logic, especially vivid in ecological struggles? Maybe would you be meaning to say that this would be a stage towards a more authentic emancipation, which would then still be against any kind of concept of sovereignty? Yeah, I don't know who's first. I suggest as Matteo to make a last round of the speakers. If maybe Michael for.
I could go first, but yeah, I'll go first because I think I might have less, even though I should have more to say than the others. I mean, Davide, without responding to your question, actually, what I loved about what you did is you drew the coherence among the projects of the 4 of us in a wonderful way that made it perfectly sensible that we would be ones talking to each other, because as you were saying, there are these transversal lines among our projects. I love that. With Elia's questions, they're super hard, or the question at least about temporality and history that you're posing, Elia, is one that requires someone to be more intelligent on the spot than I usually am. If you know what I mean. I think that there's a line that runs throughout Tony and my work that has a relationship to notions of teleology, and that we insist often is an immanent teleology. As one way of explaining it might be that it's a teleology that's built. This is a partial way of explaining it. A teleology that's built on practices of struggle. I mean, it's not as if history in some abstract way was curving towards freedom, but rather that struggles are pushing towards freedom, and that there is in some ways an historical tendency, of course, interrupted, partial, etc., towards freedom because people struggle, and it would be ridiculous to think that there weren't. So I think that there it's a teleology without end too, if that can also, it seems like it's rather, I mean, this is why Marx's notion of the tendency, which Tony had elaborated in many works, is useful. You know, thinking of this more as a vector than a endpoint. In any case, I think it's a super good and complicated question, one that we have thought about a lot. tried to work through. You know, the last question that you read from the chat, Matteo, that I didn't write down the author of the question. It might be. I feel like I'm being too simple saying something like this, but I do think that struggles affirming the subordinate nation state as a form of resistance against imperialism and against global capital had a super important role at a moment, and that it no longer does. I mean, but and maybe I put it another way, that there has been also, you know, for centuries, internationalist struggles that refuse that, and that they seems like Sandro was making an argument for this earlier and has other ways, and I think that Veronica's book emphasizes the need of constructing today new forms of internationalism which are not, of course, linked between different nationalisms, but rather a transversal form of struggle. That's what seems to me most important most important element of the agenda now, rather than struggling in the context of a reaffirmation of the nation state as a mode of defense. I mean, I guess there are plenty of examples of this, and this is political differences that would have to be explained more. I mean, in the decade of the 2000s, there were certainly many arguments among the theorists of the progressive governments in Latin America that argued for both a recognition of and a proposal of the return of the state. This was, and then there are many European parties, left forms of this reliance or an affirmation of the need of a national struggle, either against the neoliberal European Union or against something else. And I find myself opposing both of those formations. I'm not sure if that's exactly the kind of things that the questioner had in mind, but seems to be political differences that are continue to be important today. I'll stop with that.
Maybe I keep thinking the question in terms of how we can have victories. I think that this is a question. And one method or one way is the power of negation, how we can say no, for example, to say no to austerity measures, or, for example, to say no to a tax reform. It is what's happening now in Colombia, for example. But also the second way or the second step is how we can concrete those victories beyond the power of negation as a kind of partial synthesis. I don't know how to say it, but for example, to become more effective, and I think this was the experience, for example, with the fight for abortion rights in Argentina, with this double bind of reform and revolution horizon all the time putting together in the streets, in the parliamentary, but also to discuss in schools, in the streets, in the political organizations. But also, for example, what happened this weekend in Chile with the result of the constituent elections, where after the uprising of 2019, now we have this new social movement and feminist plurinational candidates discussing the constitutionalization of neoliberalism that came from Pinochet. So but also I'm thinking about the experiment with collective feminist candidates in Brazil also. How we can rethink this double movement of have victories in terms of saying no, but also how we can organize this partial synthesis in terms of also affecting the constitutional norm, the appropriation and reappropriation of wealth, and also to become an experience and a political experience for new generations. I keep thinking in these three elements of what we are discussing, because it is the way that I am how that's in relation with different forms of public institutions. It is a mixed constitution also, and it's very interesting for me how Étienne has conceptualized this relation between public and common, because it is a very expanded way of doing things in the pandemics, to reappropriate resources from the state, but also with the logic of self-management to render effective in the territories. So I keep thinking in this double way of thinking how we can have victories.
Davide,
Go
shall
ahead,
I
Jan.
speak now so that Sandro has the last word? Okay.
Yeah.
So very quickly, very quickly, Davide, you asked two questions. Let me say first that I think I'd love to continue the discussion on sovereignty with Sandro on the basis that he has laid, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. Other questions went into the same direction. So I'm not starting again, I'm just saying I believe to understand from what you said, but perhaps it's better if you say it explicitly, that the question of the nation state and the question of the modalities, historical transformations, and possible future of sovereignty as a category and as are not identical. And there's if something emerges from your description, it is, I believe, the fact that sovereignty can and perhaps must exist in today's world and tomorrow's world, either in a relative manner, that is overpower, capacity to overpower other structures, or, okay, hegemonic manner, that is not attached to the nation state. I mean, it's and in a sense, empire was going in that direction. I mean, the structures of capital as empire described a form of sovereignty that is not attached to the nation state, and I agree with that. And okay, so second, anthropological difference. It's a notion in progress. But if I try and link it with today's discussion, I would say that when I use that category, my idea is always that we are all caught, in a double bind in terms of identifications. That is, identification cannot be avoided, and even it's necessary, and it's politically necessary. But identification is not fixed. That's, of course, Deleuze and Guattari pushed this idea to the extreme. They went as far as explaining that what is revolutionary in our world is our identities, which are continuously destroyed and deterritorialized. I wouldn't go as far as that, but I would on realistic grounds. But I insist on the fact that they are not fixed. So this can be argued for, in a sense, in a reflexive manner or intrinsic manner. You take one problem of identity, and in the case of the contemporary pandemic, there's plenty to think about this. What does it mean to be healthy or sick? And collectively, of course, not only individually, but the same is true for sexual identities, class identities. That's a big problem. Is it okay? But the most interesting probably would be to say that the enormously important idea that I perceive in intersectionality, or in the form in which Veronica discussed the articulation of class, race, and gender, and the effects produced by this amazing new feminism emerging today in Argentina, Chile, and other parts of Latin America, is precisely the fact that as soon as an identity is over-determined, it ceases to be something fetishized and blocked. Okay, and then finally, a counterpower. Now, this is a fascinating issue, which I believe, in another terminology, returns to the question of the mixed constitution that Sandro was raising, and probably not by chance. In the recent past, some of us, including Sandro, including Tony, myself, etc., and others, have been arguing around the question of double power. So double power and counter power are not exactly the same thing, but they have a kind of common edge, so to speak. And needless to say, double power is anathema to to a number of people. But then there's the question of how you understand double power. And then on the other side, of course, there's another. So I'd say quickly that the specter of double power is raising its head as soon as precisely forms of resistance and struggles become autonomous enough not to become absorbed, if you like, within the more or less pattern of regulation of the existing state and dominant powers. But of course, these limits of regulation themselves are not fixed. They can be extremely narrow in so-called revolutionary situations, or they can be wider. So if they are wider, what you get, of course, is the idea of checks and balances, or even the Machiavellian idea of the tribunician, force that is an adversary within the system, pushing the system into the direction of its transformation. But there is a gray zone. There's a gray zone vital for our reflection, and probably this is very much the case in this moment, in which every attempt or certain attempts at building, I would say, counter powers and crystallizing, I would say, counter powers, finds itself in a zone of uncertainty between just adding in the long term to the checks and balances, and therefore more or less inevitably producing reforms, or bringing in something like a double power. Now, of course, Lenin and Trotsky believed that the situation with of double power is one, again, we're back to the issue of sovereignty, blah, blah, is one in which one of the two must eliminate the other. And I agree with Tony that this is not the only idea or image that we may keep in mind. But still, nevertheless, we have to admit that as soon as this, I'd say, array or specter of notions is introduced, the political situation becomes not only a flexible one, one that has possibilities of transformations, but also an extremely perilous one, and almost inevitably a violent one. And that is where we probably have been several times in the recent past, and might find ourselves again in the near future.
Well, we have a wonderful topic for the next seminar. I will quickly pick up on the questions asked by Davide. You were mentioning the notion of multiplication of labor. And that's a notion that Brett and I forged as a kind of tool for investigating the transformations of the composition of living labor. And such a investigation led us to focus on a question that seems relevant to me. I must say that I have always been worried of the notion of social movement elaborated by the sociology of social movements. A notion according to which, to oversimplify, what a social movement does is formulating a set of claims and demands. I think we have to go beyond this notion of social movement on the basis of the investigation of the composition of living labor that we have been pursuing for several years now. What we have to focus on is the capacity of movements to express and exercise power. This is the kind of reflection that led me and Brett to arc back to the question of dual power and to try to reframe the notion of counter power. What is a counter power? It is first of all the expression of the power of struggles and movements. It is not only the expression, it is also the organization in stable forms, in forms that last. The temporality is very important when we talk about counter power. Should we think of counter power outside of the state, within the state, within and against the state? Well, it depends. It depends, first of all, on the political conjuncture, on the political constellation. I can well imagine situations in which counter powers exist only outside and against the state. But I can also imagine situations in which counter powers are articulated within and against the state, and even inside political dynamics and development. Of course, we need a notion of counterpower capable to apply to a range of very different situations. And sure, if we think of counterpower in this way, we are working the boundary between reform and revolution, as Veronica was saying before. And this is another important issue that would deserve closer examination. Is it possible to think of counterpowers across and beyond national borders? Was another question asked by Davide. What I can say for sure is that it is very difficult to imagine a national counterpower. It is very difficult to imagine and construct counterpowers at the national level. And this is because counterpowers are always very closely related to specific contexts and situations that can be also traversed by transnational processes, but that it is very difficult to imagine to express at the national level. I think in the last years we had several examples of counterpowers circulating, traveling across national spaces. The feminist movement in Latin America is a good instance of that. But also think of Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter was definitely able to express and in a way to stabilize forms of counterpower. And it is due to Black Lives Matter that today in the US, the situation regarding the war in Gaza is much more open than it was years ago. Black Lives Matter became Palestinian Lives Matter. But Black Lives Matter also traveled across Europe in such places as France, Italy, the Mediterranean Sea. And I think that this is an instance of a circulation of a counterpower across national borders. Of course, the kind of routing of such counterpowers is an open problem. It is a problem that has to be dealt with in specific contexts and settings. But such a circulation of a counterpower is something I find very inspiring. It's something that leads me to continue to think about the notion of counterpower and its geography, so to say.
So thank you.
Thank you.
Matteo?
I think that we can close now our meeting. It was great, I think, and it answers to our aim that was to celebrate empire. That's sure, but also to formulate some questions, problems, challenges beyond the theoretical framework of empire and inside it. And I think the three main question was formulated. First one, problem of a revolutionary class today, multiple and intersectional class, articulation and multiplicity. Second one, the problem of reformulating a critique of political power at the global level. It was a debate between Sandro and Étienne and Michael. And the last point was a theory of social transformation today. That was debate about dual power or counter power or others power against capital centralization and synchronization of multiplicity. And thank you again. And I think that I hope that we could continue the discussion face to face and in the near future.
Matteo, can we say a word of gratitude, admiration, and love to Jay, that is the absent cause
of course
of all this?
Silent J.
Silent J, yes.
The ghost of communism.
He's not a ghost.
Europe.
He's a powerful force and mind. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very
Bye.
much. It was late. Ciao.
Thank you.
Bye.
Michael, great to see you. Great to see you. Hope
Yeah.
to see you again soon.
Indeed.
Right.
Ciao. Ciao.
Ciao.
Thanks,
Ciao.
everybody.
Ciao.